Okay, let's unpack this. Have you ever been listening to music, maybe shuffling through a playlist, and suddenly one song is way louder than the last?
Oh, absolutely. Or maybe you finally hear that new track you were hyped about on your favorite streaming service and it just doesn't quite hit right.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe it sounds quieter than you expected, or somehow less impactful, or even worse, kind of distorted.
It's a near universal experience in the modern digital age, isn't it? That jarring inconsistency, like the volume knob has a mind of its own depending on what you're listening to or where you're listening to it.
Right. And you might intuitively think, oh, it's just the volume. Someone recorded it louder. But the truth is, it's tied into a much more complex world than simply turning a dial.
Definitely.
Today, we're taking a deep dive into loudness in audio. We're not just talking about cranking the volume on your stereo, we're exploring the intricate, often subjective, and deeply technical landscape that shapes how we perceive sound strength, how it's measured, and how producers and engineers navigate this world, especially in genres built on impact, like EDM.
And to guide us through this, we've pulled insights from a really comprehensive source. An article on audiojack.com titled EDM 6 Tips to a Loud Mix and Your Full Loudness Guide. It provides a fantastic roadmap covering the history, the essential measurement techniques, the challenges thrown up by the digital era and streaming, and, the modern best practices.
So our mission in this deep dive is to extract the most important nuggets from that audiojack.com source. We want to understand what loudness truly means today, the fascinating journey to figure out how to measure something that feels so personal and subjective.
Which is the core challenge, really.
Exactly. And the seismic shift caused by streaming platforms, and crucially, how artists and engineers, particularly in electronic music, balance the need for power and energy with the demands of a world where everyone hears their music through different systems and different services. This deep dive should give you a real shortcut to being well informed on this absolutely critical aspect of audio production and help you understand exactly why some tracks feel vibrant and consistently present, while others just don't translate.
It's truly remarkable how this field has transformed. The focus has fundamentally shifted from a simple race to be the technically loudest to a much more nuanced approach. It's focused on ensuring your music translates with its intended impact and sounds its best everywhere it's heard.
Absolutely. And that shift begins with acknowledging the fundamental challenge, the subjective nature of loudness itself.
Yes, that's the bedrock of the problem. Loudness is, first and foremost, our individual subjective perception of a sound's strength. What feels comfortably loud to me in this room might feel too quiet or even too loud to you.
Right.
This perception is influenced by countless factors: our own hearing, our mood, the environment we're in, the type of music, even how recently we've heard something much louder or quieter. This inherent human variability means you can't just rely on someone saying, make it louder, and have a consistent outcome for everyone.
Right. And this subjectivity is precisely why we get that frustrating inconsistency we started with. Think about putting together a playlist from different albums released over the years, or even just tracks from different artists today. Some tracks jump out, others recede.
Or you master a track in your studio, it sounds massive, and then you upload it to a streaming platform, and it sounds, well, smaller. That's often loudness inconsistency at play.
Precisely. Because human perception is so variable and difficult to standardize, the audio world absolutely needed objective ways to measure sound levels. We needed metrics that could provide a reliable technical bridge between the raw audio signal and our subjective experience of loudness.
Yeah, and early attempts at measurement were often purely electrical or acoustic signal levels. They were accurate in a purely technical sense, sure, but they often failed to capture how our ears actually process and perceive volume, especially across different frequencies.
So the history of audio measurement is really a story of trying to get closer and closer to mimicking human hearing with objective tools.
That's a great way to put it. It's an evolution from just measuring raw signal amplitude to developing systems that incorporate psychoacoustics, how our brains and ears work together to perceive sound. This quest for perceptually accurate measurement is what led to the sophisticated units we rely on today.
And underpinning all of that measurement, the absolute fundamental language of audio engineering is the decibel.
Ah, the venerable decibel, or dB. It truly is the core unit. At its heart, the decibel is a logarithmic measure. It's not an absolute value on its own. It expresses the relative amplitude or strength of an audio signal. Think of it as a ratio expressed on a logarithmic scale.
And why logarithmic? That sounds like a math class I tried very hard to forget.
Well, I understand the feeling, but it's actually brilliant for audio, almost perfectly suited to how our ears work. Our hearing system has an absolutely immense dynamic range. The quietest sound we can detect, compared to a sound loud enough to cause pain or permanent damage, differs by a factor of over 1 million in terms of sound pressure.
Wow, a million times difference.
Exactly. Representing that huge range linearly would be completely impractical. The logarithmic scale of the decibel compresses this vast range into a much more manageable scale, roughly 0 to 120 dBs. It's like using a scale for earthquakes or star brightness. It makes enormous numbers accessible.
Okay, so it handles huge ranges effectively. Is there another reason it works well for audio?
Yes, and this is where it connects back to that subjective perception. While not a perfect one-to-one match, our subjective perception of loudness scales more closely with the logarithmic change in signal level than a linear one. What feels like a doubling of loudness doesn't come from simply doubling the voltage or sound pressure. It requires a significant multiplicative increase, which aligns better with the steps on the dB scale.
So, like, a 3 dB or 6 dB increase feels like a consistent step up in loudness, regardless of where you start.
Pretty much, yeah. It mirrors how our ears respond to changes in intensity, making it incredibly useful for quantifying perceived changes.
Got it. So it handles massive ranges and roughly aligns with how our ears perceive changes. But you mentioned it's relative. What does that mean in practice?
That's the crucial point about dB. A number like plus 6 dB is meaningless on its own. It always refers to a comparison 6 dB more than some reference level. To define an absolute level, you need a specific, defined 0 dB reference point. Without that baseline, you can't say how loud something is, only how much louder or quieter it is compared to something else.
Okay, so the reference point is everything. The audiojack.com article highlights some common ones we encounter in audio.
Right. The most intuitive for everyday listening is dB-SPL, or sound pressure level. This measures the actual acoustic sound pressure in the air. The reference, 0 dB-SPL, is conventionally set at 20 micropascals, which is a standard approximation for the quietest sound pressure the average young human ear can theoretically detect. It's what sound level meters measure in a room.
And then there's the one we see constantly in music software. Yeah. dBFS, decibels full scale.
Exactly. This is the workhorse for digital audio. Here, 0 dBFS is the hard upper limit, the absolute maximum numerical value a digital system can represent. Attempting to go above this results in digital clipping.
Which sounds awful.
Oh, terrible.
Yeah.
A harsh, unpleasant distortion where the top of the waveform is simply cut off. Crucially, all other dBFS values are negative. Max 1 dBFS, negative 6 dBFS, negative 18 dBFS. These all represent levels below that maximum digital ceiling. In a final digital file, you simply cannot exceed 0 dBFS without destroying information.
The source also mentions dBu and dBV for analog audio voltage.
Yes, these are key players in the analog world, dealing with the electrical signals that flow between physical gear like microphones, preamps, compressors, and mixers. 0 dBu is referenced to 0.775 volts, and 0 dBV is referenced to 1 volt.
So important if you're using hardware.
Absolutely. While you might not see these constantly if you're purely in the digital domain, understanding them is vital for proper gain staging when using analog equipment. It's about ensuring you send optimal signal levels between devices to maintain signal integrity and avoid introducing noise or distortion.
Now, the source goes into a detail about calculation differences, 10 log versus 20 log. That sounds quite technical.
It is a bit, but the core idea is simple once you grasp the principle. The formula for calculating the dB difference depends on what physical quantity you're measuring. If you're measuring a quantity directly proportional to power, like electrical power in watts, the formula is 10 times the logarithm of the ratio of the two power levels.
And the takeaway there is?
The key takeaway here is that a plus 3 dB increase represents a doubling of power.
Wait, only plus 3 dB is double the power. That feels small somehow. My intuition thought it would be a much bigger number.
It's that logarithmic scale at work. Now, if you're measuring a field quantity, like voltage or sound pressure, which is proportional to the square root of power, the formula uses 20 times the logarithm of the ratio.
So for those quantities?
For voltage or sound pressure, a plus 6 dB change means the voltage or sound pressure has doubled. Ah, okay. So doubling the electrical power output of an amplifier is plus 3 dB, but doubling the voltage going into a piece of gear, or doubling the actual sound pressure hitting your ear, is plus 6 dB.
Exactly. That's the fundamental distinction. Knowing whether a meter is showing you something related to power or voltage pressure is key to interpreting the dB values correctly. There's a bit of audio physics, but it underpins how all these measurements work.
It really feels like this concept of dB, its relative nature, the logarithmic scale, and these different reference points, is the bedrock for understanding everything else about audio levels.
It absolutely is. Mastering this fundamental concept is step one in navigating the world of loudness and levels effectively, and the power of the logarithmic scale aligning with our perception is precisely why it's been the standard for so long.
So using this language of decibels, let's dive into the actual units and meters we use to measure and control audio levels today. As you mentioned, different units give us different perspectives on the audio signal. Absolutely. Each type of measurement tool and unit highlights a specific characteristic of the audio signal and serves a different purpose in the mixing and mastering process.
Starting with the most basic and immediate, we have peak levels.
Right. Peak level, most commonly measured in dBFS in the digital realm, is the simplest, most immediate measurement. It tells you the absolute highest instantaneous amplitude of the audio signal at a specific point in time. Think of it as the tip of the highest spike in the waveform.
And the primary importance here is preventing that digital clipping we talked about.
Exactly. As we hammered home with dBFS, exceeding 0 dBFS results in data loss and harsh distortion. Peak meters are your absolute essential tool for ensuring that the signal never hits or exceeds that digital ceiling.
Even though some software can handle levels above 0 internally.
Right, modern DAWs often use floating point processing internally, which allows levels temporarily over 0 dBFS without clipping within the software. But the crucial point is, the final output file, the WAV or MP3U export, must always remain at or below dBFS to avoid irreversible distortion.
Okay, so standard peak is about preventing the hard digital wall. But then the source introduces true peak, or BBTP, which is described as being more accurate. Why do we need true peak if we're already watching standard peak?
This is where things get particularly sneaky and is absolutely critical in the modern world of digital audio, especially streaming. True peak accounts for something standard peak meters completely miss: intersample peaks.
Intersample peaks. Peaks that happen between the actual digital samples. How is that even possible? It sounds counterintuitive. The samples are the data, right?
It does sound counterintuitive, but remember, digital audio is just a series of snapshot samples of the original continuous sound wave. When your digital audio is converted back to analog by a DIA, a digital to analog converter.
Like in your phone or your computer sound card.
Exactly. Or when a streaming service transcodes your high-resolution master file into a lower bitrate lossy format like MP3, AAC, or OGG Vorbis, the system has to reconstruct the smooth, continuous waveform from those discrete samples. During this reconstruction or conversion process, the actual peak level of the reconstructed waveform can sometimes occur in between the points where the original samples were taken.
So the original sample points might all be below 0, but the wave connecting them actually goes higher.
Precisely. A standard peak meter only looks at the samples themselves and won't see these hidden peaks.
Wow. So my perfect master file might look clean with sample peaks at, say, -0.5 dBFS, but it could still have these invisible peaks that pop up above 0 dBFS later.
Exactly. And these hidden intersample peaks, even if they're only fractionally above 0 dBFS, can cause audible distortion and clipping when the audio is eventually played back through a DEC or processed by a streaming codec. This is a major culprit for masters that sound clean in the studio, but introduce unexpected distortion for the end listener on their devices.
That's wild. So how do true peak meters catch these?
They solve this by essentially oversampling the signal. As defined by standards like ITU BS.177, true peak meters work by oversampling the digital signal, typically by a factor of 4 or more. This effectively creates extra interpolated data points between the original samples, allowing the meter to get a much more accurate prediction of the waveform's true maximum level during reconstruction.
So it's like looking closer between the dots.
Exactly. A true peak meter will show you these potential intersample peaks, often indicating levels slightly higher than a standard sample peak meter. It can even show values above 0 dBFS when a standard meter might still be negative, alerting you to the risk of distortion down the line.
This seems absolutely vital for anyone mastering for streaming platforms then. It's non-negotiable.
It is non-negotiable. Because streaming services heavily rely on lossy codecs, managing true peak is crucial for fidelity. Platforms have specific recommendations, commonly targeting a true peak ceiling of -1 dBTP or even -2 dBTP for masters.
Why the buffer? Why not just 0 dBTP?
That buffer ensures that even after their internal processing and transcoding, the reconstructed waveform doesn't clip. Many modern digital limiters have a true peak setting that prevents the output from exceeding a user-defined dBTP value. It's essential for ensuring your music reaches listeners without added distortion.
Okay, so peak prevents the immediate digital clip. True peak prevents that sneaky distortion later, especially online. What about RMS? We see RMS meters too.
RMS, or root mean square, offers a different perspective entirely. Instead of a single instantaneous point, RMS measures the average level or power of the signal over a short, defined period of time, often around 300 milliseconds.
So more like an average loudness.
Kind of. Historically, RMS was often considered a better indicator of perceived loudness than peak meters, because it looked at the sustained energy of the signal, not just the fastest transient spike. It was also widely used for calculating the power handling requirements of speaker systems.
Is this still relevant today?
Absolutely. RMS levels are still incredibly valuable for analyzing the overall fullness and consistency of energy within a track, or even comparing tracks on an album. It gives you a good sense of the average weight of the sound. It's very useful for balancing elements within a mix, ensuring the bass is consistently supportive, for example.
But it has limitations.
Yes. Its key limitation, especially compared to modern methods, is that it measures raw energy without factoring in the human ear's varying sensitivity to different frequencies.
Now those loudness curves we touched on earlier, RMS doesn't consider those.
Exactly. An RMS meter treats energy at 50 hertz and energy at 3 kilohertz the same, even though your ear is far more sensitive to the energy at 3 kilohertz. So while it's a useful technical average, an RMS reading doesn't perfectly align with how loud you will actually perceive the sound.
Which brings us to the unit that seems to be the current industry standard, especially for broadcast and streaming, LUFS.
Yes, LUFS, or Loudness Units Full Scale, represents the state-of-the-art in standardized loudness measurement. It's the culmination of this journey towards matching objective measurement with subjective perception. Its explicit goal is to ensure consistent perceived loudness by integrating the technical signal intensity with a model of how the human auditory system works. It's the latest, most accurate evolution in objective measurement.
So it's designed to hear more like a human.
Precisely. LUFS values, like DBFS, are negative, but they quantify perceived loudness. A value of -6 LUFS is perceived as louder than -16 LUFS, and a loudest unit, LU, is a relative difference between two LUFS values, equivalent in magnitude to 1 dB, but specifically measuring perceived loudness change.
And the key technological leap here is, what makes it mimic the ear?
K-weighting. LUFS measurements adhere to standards like ITUR BS.20 which mandate the use of K-weighting. This is a specific frequency filter applied to the audio signal before the average loudness is measured. This filter is designed to mimic the frequency response of the human ear at typical listening levels. Our ears are most sensitive to frequencies in the mid-range, roughly 1 kilohertz to 5 kilohertz, and less sensitive to very low or very high frequencies.
So the K-weighting filter is essentially giving the LUFS meter ears. It's prioritizing the frequencies that our own ears are most sensitive to when calculating the overall loudness.
That's the perfect way to think about it. This psychoacoustic refinement is what makes LUFS readings correlate so strongly with perceived loudness. Unlike RMS, which gives you a raw energy average, LUFS gives you an average weighted by how our ears actually respond to those frequencies, making it the most reliable indicator of how loud the track will feel to the listener across different systems, assuming proper playback.
And there are different ways to measure LUFS, different timescales.
Yes, depending on the time window you're using. The most critical for mastering and distribution is integrated LUFS. This is the overall average perceived loudness of the entire audio program from start to finish. This is the value that streaming services and broadcasters analyze to determine the normalization level for a track or show.
Okay, so integrated is the big number the platforms care about, the average for the whole track.
Exactly. Then there's short-term LUFS, which measures the perceived loudness over a rolling window, typically around 3 seconds. This is invaluable during mixing and mastering for seeing how the perceived loudness is changing within the song, how much punch the chorus has compared to the verse, or if a bridge is dropping off too much.
Useful for checking section differences. And finally, momentary LUFS.
That's the shortest window, around 400 milliseconds. Think of this like a fast-reacting peak meter, but measuring perceived loudness rather than raw amplitude. It gives you a quick sense of the instantaneous perceived loudness at any given moment.
So, looking at this whole journey from simple peak meters trying to prevent clipping, to RMS giving an average power but ignoring our ears, to LUFS using K-weighting to genuinely reflect how we hear. It clearly shows how the industry had to evolve its measurements.
Absolutely. It had to tackle the initial problem of subjective inconsistency and ensure audio translates effectively. The progression from purely technical measurements to psychoacoustically informed ones like LUFS wasn't just academic, it was a practical necessity driven by the challenges of ensuring consistency and fidelity in the digital age.
We needed something reliable.
We needed a standard that could guarantee a consistent perceived loudness across vastly different content and playback systems, and LUFS, with its K-weighting and established standards like ITUR BS.1770 and EBUR 128, provides that. It was essential to bring predictability and quality back to audio levels.
While we're deep in the world of measurement, there's another crucial concept that's intrinsically linked to loudness and impact: dynamic range.
Ah, yes, dynamic range. If loudness is the overall level, dynamic range is about the variation in levels within the music. It's defined as the difference in volume, typically measured in dB, between the absolute quietest and the absolute loudest parts of an audio signal or a piece of audio equipment.
So, if the softest moment in a song is -50 dBFS and the loudest is -5 dBFS, that song has a 45 dB dynamic range.
Precisely. And for a piece of equipment, it describes the range between its noise floor, the quietest it can be, and its maximum output level before distortion. A wider dynamic range means the system, or the music itself, can accommodate and reproduce both very quiet and very loud passages clearly and without introducing unwanted noise or distortion.
And why is having a good, healthy dynamic range important for the music itself? Why not just make everything loud?
For several fundamental reasons. First, clarity and detail. A wide dynamic range allows the listener to clearly perceive subtle details: the delicate shimmer of a cymbal, the quiet strum of an acoustic guitar, the breathiness of a vocal right alongside the powerful, loud elements like a kick drum or a distorted guitar riff.
If everything's loud, those subtleties get lost.
They get buried and lost. Second, and perhaps most critically, it's essential for emotional impact and engagement. Music relies on contrast. The tension built by quiet passages and the release of energy in loud sections are fundamental to creating excitement, drama, immersion, and feeling. A song with good dynamic range breathes. It has peaks and valleys that take the listener on a journey.
I really like that idea, dynamic range, as the storytelling arc of the music's volume. It's the light and shade.
It absolutely is. It's about using volume changes intentionally to enhance the narrative and emotional curve of the track.
And the consequence of not having enough dynamic range is something we often heard during the loudness war, which resulted in heavily overcompressed music.
Exactly. Excessive compression, where engineers crush the dynamic range to make the track uniformly loud, leads to a sound that is often described as flattened, lifeless, mushy, or simply tiresome. All those subtle contrasts are gone, and everything is just pushed to a similar high level.
Which is where that phenomenon of listening fatigue comes in. It just wears you out.
Right. If your ears and brain are constantly presented with a wall of sound at a near constant high volume, without any natural moments of quiet or contrast, it becomes tiring to listen to after just a few minutes. It completely validates that old adage: if everything is loud, nothing is loud. Without the backdrop of quiet, the loud parts lose their impact and simply become fatiguing.
So the goal isn't just loudness. It's controlling the relationship between loud and quiet. And mastering engineers have a whole toolbox dedicated to sculpting this dynamic range.
They do. The tools are used not just to hit technical targets, but to shape the emotional feel and energy of the music according to the artist's intent and the genre's conventions.
The most fundamental and versatile tool is compression. We hear about it all the time.
Compression is key to controlling the difference between loud and quiet. At its core, it automatically reduces the level of the loudest parts of a signal whenever they exceed a certain threshold. It can also be used to simultaneously boost the quieter parts, though this is less common with standard compression than with specific techniques.
So the main effect is narrowing the dynamic range, making it more consistent.
That's the net effect, yes. It reduces or narrows the dynamic range, making the audio's overall volume more consistent. Engineers fine-tune its behavior using parameters like threshold, ratio, attack, and release.
The source mentions a specific application, low-level or upward compression. What's that about?
Yes, this is a really powerful technique, particularly useful in genres like dance music. Instead of reacting to and turning down the loud parts, upward compression increases the gain of signals that fall below a certain threshold.
So it brings up the quiet stuff.
Exactly. It subtly brings up the quieter elements, background synths, reverb tails, atmospheric details, making them more audible and defined without affecting the loud peaks. It's a way to add perceived density and richness without further reducing the loud parts.
And limiting is a more aggressive form of compression.
Like a brick wall.
Precisely. Limiting is essentially compression with a very high ratio, often infinite, meaning once the signal hits the threshold, which is typically set just below 0 dBFS or your target true peak.
It just stops it going any higher.
Right. Its main purpose in mastering is to set a hard absolute ceiling on the maximum volume, preventing digital clipping and defining the very top of your dynamic range. While it is a dynamic processor and significantly reduces dynamic range, its primary function is often safety and precise peak control.
How does EQ, equalization, fit into controlling dynamic range? It's not a dynamic processor, is it? It's not a dynamic processor in the same way, no, but it absolutely subtly alters perceived loudness and dynamics. By boosting or cutting specific frequency ranges, you can make certain elements sound more prominent or less prominent without necessarily changing their raw peak level.
So changing the frequency balance changes how loud things feel.
Exactly. For instance, boosting frequencies that our ears are highly sensitive to can make a vocal or a synth line feel much louder or more present in the mix, even if its overall meter level hasn't increased dramatically. It affects the tonal balance within the dynamic range, guiding the listener's ear and creating contrast.
And stereo imaging, how does width play into this?
Adjusting the stereo width and depth can also indirectly impact how dynamic range is perceived. A very wide mix might feel less dense and potentially allow for slightly less compression, while a narrower mix might feel more solid and focused. It affects how the energy is spread out in the soundstage.
Finally, the most direct way to control dynamic range manually, volume automation, just drawing it in.
This is the intentional artistic control. It's about manually adjusting the volume levels of tracks or groups of tracks over time to deliberately shape the dynamics of the song. You use automation to create swells of tension before a drop, dip levels for a dramatic moment, bring an instrument forward for a solo, or balance vocals precisely against an instrumental bed. It allows for precise musical sculpting of the volume journey.
So these tools together aren't just about hitting a technical number. They are the ways engineers sculpt the feel, the energy, and the emotional flow of the music. It's artistry.
Exactly. They are the essential tools for translating the artist's dynamic intent into a final master, working within the technical constraints.
And to use these tools effectively, you absolutely need accurate metering. You can't just rely on your ears, which, as we discussed, are subjective and can get fatigued.
Absolutely crucial. Metering provides objective data to inform your subjective decisions. It tells you what's happening technically and, with modern meters, perceptually.
The source mentions dynamic range meters, DRM. Are these common?
They are available, yes. These are meters specifically designed to give you a numerical representation, usually in dB, of the difference between the loudest and quietest sections of your audio, providing a specific value for the dynamic range.
And the loudness meters we discussed, adhering to standards like ITUR BS.1770, those seem essential now.
Those are the essential tools for today. They measure perceived loudness, LUFS, and are inherently linked to dynamic range. Many also include features like loudness range, LRA, which gives you a statistical measure of how much the perceived loudness varies over the duration of the track.
So LRA tells you about the overall dynamic variation perceptually.
Exactly. Integrated LUFS is the overall average. LRA tells you about the macro dynamics, the spread of loudness within the track.
And spectrum analyzers, how do they help with dynamics?
While not a dynamic range meter per se, a spectrum analyzer is vital. It visually displays the frequency content of your audio, how much energy is in the lows, mids, and highs. This is crucial because frequency balance dramatically impacts perceived loudness and can highlight where energy is concentrated, which might affect how you use dynamic processors or if you're eating up headroom unnecessarily in certain frequency bands.
Makes sense. You need to see where the energy lives.
Yeah.
The source gives some best practices for metering.
Yes, fundamental things like ensuring your listening environment and monitoring system are properly calibrated so what you hear accurately reflects what the meters show.
Critical first step.
Absolutely. And continuously monitoring your meters while you're mixing and mastering, especially after applying processing, to see the real-time impact on levels, dynamic range, and loudness.
See the cause and effect.
Right. And always using a spectrum analyzer alongside your other meters to keep that crucial frequency balance in check.
It really is like needing multiple maps or tools to navigate a complex landscape. Each meter gives you a different essential piece of information about the audio.
Precisely. They provide the objective data points that guide the subjective, creative decisions of sculpting the sound.
And speaking of creative decisions, the source makes a crucial point. There's no single ideal dynamic range that works for all music. It's heavily dependent on the genre.
This is so important to understand. The optimal dynamic range isn't a fixed technical target you blindly chase. It's an artistic choice, deeply intertwined with the genre's conventions, the artist's intention, and where the music is meant to be heard.
So mastering really is an art form where creative and genre-specific choices often take precedence over rigid numbers.
Absolutely. A mastering engineer isn't just a technician. They're interpreting the emotional core of the music and preparing it to connect with the listener in its intended context. That context is vastly different for a classical piece versus a club track.
The source provides a fantastic table of typical dynamic range guidelines by genre. Let's look at a few to see the spectrum.
Okay. At the widest end, classical music often has a dynamic range of 20-30 dB. This wide range is fundamental to the expression of the music, allowing for huge contrast between incredibly quiet, delicate passages and overwhelming fortissimo bursts of sound. It captures the full breadth of an orchestral performance.
Makes sense. You need that whisper to roar range. Moving to a medium range, jazz is typically around 12-20 dB and blues around 10-15 dB.
These genres value nuance and interplay between instruments, requiring enough dynamic range for individual lines and solos to stand out and interact, while still having enough compression to feel cohesive and energetic.
Rock is often cited around 10-15 dB, and pop frequently sits in the 6-12 dB range. Feels like things are getting tighter.
You see more deliberate dynamic control here. Rock music often limits dynamic range to keep the driving elements drums, bass, guitars, vocals consistently present and impactful for that feeling of intensity. Pop masters are frequently even more controlled, aiming for a bright, energetic, consistently loud presentation designed to jump out on radio and playlists.
And here's where the EDM focus from the source comes in. Electronic dance music, EDM, and hip-hop are listed as having a typically more limited range, often around 6-9 dB, and sometimes even pushed as far as 3-6 dBs for EDM. That's quite compressed.
That's right. These genres often prioritize a very high average perceived loudness and consistent energy, which requires significant dynamic range reduction. For EDM, this is crucial for the dance floor environment, ensuring consistent impact through huge sound systems and making it easy for DJs to mix tracks seamlessly without drastic level shifts.
And at the other extreme again, film scores can have a very wide dynamic range, often over 20 dB.
Similar to classical music, this is for dramatic effect. The contrast between very quiet, tense moments and sudden, loud, epic explosions of sound is a key tool in building atmosphere and emotion in film.
It's really telling how different genres require such different approaches to dynamic range. But as the source notes, these are just rough guidelines. Don't treat them as gospel.
Absolutely. They are starting points based on common practice. The optimal range for any specific song within a genre depends on its unique arrangement, production style, and the specific artistic vision. A great mastering engineer knows when to adhere to these guidelines and when to subtly push or pull the dynamic range to best serve the music itself.
Now, all this talk of pushing levels and a reduced dynamic range brings us squarely to a notorious period in audio history, the Loudness War.
Ah, the Loudness War. It was a relentless trend across the music industry to make each new release progressively louder than the last. It wasn't really about dynamic range as an artistic choice anymore. It was about competitive level maximization.
The source mentions it really intensified with digital audio, but its roots go back further, like way back.
That's right. While it reached its peak, pun intended, in the digital age, the idea of making tracks hotter has existed for decades. There are stories from the 1940s about mastering engineers cutting singles hot for jukeboxes or radio because the slightly louder track would catch the listener's ear first.
So the louder one got noticed.
Yeah, and Motown was apparently known for mastering its 45s with famously high levels for the time.
So the idea that louder is better was a competitive instinct that predates digital.
Absolutely. But the compact disc CD in the 1980s was the true turning point that escalated it into a war. Vinyl had physical limitations. You couldn't cut the grooves too wide or the needle would skip, limiting how much low-end and overall level you could have, especially in a loud section.
Digital didn't have those physical limits.
Exactly. Digital media, specifically the CD format's fixed 0 dBFS ceiling, removed those physical barriers. There was no physical reason you couldn't make the track level sit right up against that 0 dBFS limit constantly.
And that lack of constraint led to engineers pushing harder and harder. Just keep turning it up.
Exactly. Using increasingly powerful compressors and limiters, releases got progressively louder through the late 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s. This led to the visual phenomenon known as brick walling.
Where the waveform just looks like a solid brick, no variation.
Right. slammed up against 0 dBFS, indicating almost no dynamic variation. The widespread availability of powerful and transparent-sounding digital limiters, like the Waves L1 first released in 1994, made it technically feasible for almost anyone to push levels to these extremes easily.
And the sonic consequences were not good.
Yeah.
Often pretty bad, actually.
They were severe. The source lists the outcomes. Significantly reduced fidelity because quiet details were crushed. A flattened, mushy, aggressive, and frankly tiresome sound. And in the worst cases, outright distortion and clipping, even if the file was technically below 0 dBFS.
Because of those intersample peaks again.
Often due to those neglected intersample peaks, yeah.
The source mentions some infamous examples that really highlighted the problem and faced major backlash from listeners.
Yes, albums like Red Hot Chili Peppers' Californication from 1999 and especially Metallica's Death Magnetic from 2008 became poster children for the loudness war. Listeners, even non-audio professionals, complained about how fatiguing and distorted they sound.
People noticed.
Oh yeah. It became undeniable that simply being louder did not, in fact, mean sounding better. Quality was being sacrificed for level.
And this is where loudness normalization, implemented by streaming services and broadcasters, stepped in and fundamentally changed the game. The platforms fought back.
This was the crucial development that effectively ended the competitive incentive of the loudness war, at least for music distribution online. Platforms began analyzing the integrated LUFS level of every track, and often entire albums.
That overall average loudness we talked about.
Exactly. And they automatically adjust the playback volume to a consistent target level for their service.
So instead of each track playing back at whatever level it was mastered to, the platform makes them all play at roughly the same perceived loudness. No more huge volume jumps.
Exactly. The goal is a more balanced and comfortable listening experience for the user across different tracks and genres in a playlist or on a radio station. And here's the key strategic element. If your master is significantly louder than the platform's target LUFS, they simply turn it down. They apply negative gain to bring it to the target.
So pushing your master super loud doesn't make you sound louder on the platform anymore. It just means they turn you down. That kills the whole point of the loudness war.
Precisely. It completely negates the competitive advantage of making your master excessively loud. And because those overly loud masters from the loudness war era were achieved by crushing the dynamic range and often introducing artifacts, when the platform turns them down to the target LUFS, they often sound noticeably weaker, flatter, and less dynamic than tracks mastered with more moderation to begin with.
So the flaws get exposed when they're turned down. They sound worse.
The flaws of overcompression are exposed. They can sound really bad.
What about tracks that are mastered more quietly, maybe closer to the platform target or even below it? Did they get turned up?
They may receive positive gain compensation to bring them up closer to the target level. However, this boost is limited by the track's true peak headroom. If a track is mastered quietly but has intersample peaks close to 0 dBFS, the platform can't boost it much without causing distortion.
And some platforms don't boost at all.
Right. As the source mentions, some platforms like YouTube actually only turn audio down. They don't boost quieter tracks at all. So if your track is significantly below YouTube's NAGAT 14 LUFS target, it will simply play back quieter relative to everything else on their platform.
Good to know. So this forced a fundamental shift in how engineers approach mastering. A whole new philosophy.
It absolutely did. The focus shifted from achieving the highest possible level against the 0 dBFS ceiling back towards prioritizing dynamic range, sonic quality, and fidelity. Engineers now master with the understanding that the playback level will likely be adjusted by the platform. The goal is to make the track sound excellent at its intended relative loudness and with healthy dynamics, confident that it will translate consistently once normalization is applied.
It really did level the playing field and put the emphasis back on artistic translation and quality over just brute force level, making things sound good, not just loud.
Precisely. It was a necessary correction to a trend that was actively harming audio quality.
Which makes understanding those specific streaming platform loudness targets absolutely essential for anyone releasing music today. You have to know the rules of the game.
They are the de facto standard for distribution. Knowing the target integrated LUFS and maintaining adequate true peak headroom is crucial for ensuring your music is heard as intended by the vast majority of listeners who use these services.
The audiojack.com source provides targets for several major platforms. Let's run through them quickly.
Okay. Starting with the biggest, Spotify targets -14 LUFS integrated. For true peak, they recommend a ceiling of -1 dBTP if your track hits their -14 LUFS target, or -2 dBTP if you've mastered it hotter than -14 LUFS, which they will turn down.
And they turn up quieter tracks if they can.
They attempt to boost quieter tracks up, but again, that boost is limited by true peak headroom. They also perform album normalization, so all tracks within one album are consistent relative to each other before the album itself is normalized to the platform target.
Apple Music, using its sound check feature, targets -16 LUFS integrated. A bit quieter.
Yes, a slightly more conservative target, preferred by some engineers. They aim for a -1 dBTP ceiling. Like Spotify, they turn louder tracks down and quieter ones up, limited by either hitting 0 dBFS peak or their interesting LUFS target. Apple Music's Soundcheck also offers album normalization.
YouTube is listed with a target of -14 LUFS integrated, same as Spotify.
Matching Spotify on the LUFS target, but often with a slightly lower recommended true peak ceiling, perhaps a maximum 1.5 to -2 dBTP due to its encoding methods. Crucially, remember YouTube's behavior. It only turns audio down if it's louder than -14 LUFS. It does not boost quieter tracks.
So if you're too quiet on YouTube, you just stay quiet.
Right. It will simply play back softer compared to other videos or music on YouTube.
Tidal is also listed at -14 LUFS integrated.
Similar target to Spotify and YouTube, and they also normalize louder tracks down.
And Qobuz, often favored by audiophiles for high-resolution audio, seems to have a slightly more conservative approach, sometimes cited around -18 LUFS, though the source notes a specific LUFS target isn't always explicit.
Right. For high-resolution platforms like Qobuz, engineers often aim for more dynamic range, and a true peak ceiling of -1 dBTP or lower is strongly recommended, especially for ensuring quality with high bit depth audio.
That consistent emphasis on true peak really highlights its importance in this normalization era. It keeps coming up.
It's absolutely critical. As we discussed, hitting the LUFS target is only half the battle. If your true peak levels are too high, even just nudging above 0 dBFS, those intersample peaks will cause audible distortion when the platform's codecs convert your file. Maintaining that buffer, that -1 dBTP or -2 dBTP ceiling, is just as vital as your LUFS target for delivering a clean, undistorted master that sounds good after processing.
So the modern approach is about mastering effectively for normalization.
Yeah.
Not fighting against it by just trying to be loud. Work with the system.
Exactly. Deliver a high-quality master with appropriate dynamics and true peak headroom, confident that the platform will set the final playback level consistently. Focus on how it sounds at the intended level, not just how loud you can slam it.
And this brings us back to the core focus of the audiojack.com article, mastering modern dance music, like EDM. It seems there's a unique challenge here, balancing the need for maximum impact in a club with these streaming normalization standards.
It's a fascinating tightrope walk for EDM producers and mastering engineers. Modern dance music demands energy, punch, and a feeling of consistent power. It absolutely has to work on huge, loud club sound systems, but it also needs to translate and sound great through earbuds, car stereos, and home systems via streaming.
Historically, as we saw in those genre guidelines, EDM often pushed levels incredibly hard, far exceeding 96 LUFS integrated, super loud.
That was driven by the club environment and the needs of DJs mixing live. Louder tracks felt more competitive in a set, but the streaming era introduced this tension. Streaming targets are much quieter, -14 or -16 LUFS.
So what do producers do now?
Well, the source points out that many producers still aim significantly louder than those streaming targets, often mastering in the -8 to -10 LUFS range, sometimes even pushing to -7 LUFS.
Even though the streamer will just turn it down, why?
The belief is often that this is necessary to achieve a club-ready sound, or that it somehow sounds more competitive even after being turned down. There's still that psychological pull towards louder masters.
But the source also mentions conflicting views within the community.
Yes, with some experienced engineers advocating for mastering EDM tracks more conservatively, closer to the Indivic 16 LUFS range perhaps, arguing you should let the DJs handle the necessary gain boosting in the club environment.
Which, from a normalization perspective, makes a lot of sense, right?
It does. A track mastered around -16 LUFS with good dynamics and headroom will likely sound fantastic when turned up by the streaming platform or by a DJ. An overcompressed track mastered to -8 LUFS, however, will have its flaws exposed when the platform turns it down to -14 LUFS. It might sound flat and lifeless compared to a more dynamic track at the same playback level.
And for EDM, true peak is still massively important, given all the processing.
Absolutely vital. Due to the genre's dense arrangements, use of heavy limiting, and often bright or powerful mid-range elements, EDM tracks are highly susceptible to generating troublesome intersample peaks. Maintaining a true peak ceiling of Metis 1 dBTP or Nevis 2 dBTP is essential to prevent audible distortion when these tracks hit the lossy codecs used by streaming services.
What specific mastering techniques does the source highlight as key for achieving that desired impact in EDM while navigating these standards? How do they make it work?
They point to several crucial techniques. Low-level or upward compression, as we discussed earlier, is particularly important. It brings out those subtle textures, atmospheres, and quiet percussive elements in EDM without further crushing the loud parts, adding perceived density and detail that makes the master feel richer and more complete.
So it adds fullness without just squashing everything. Mid-side equalization is also listed.
Yes, this is very effective in dance music. It allows you to EQ the mono information, the mid channel, often where the kick, bass, and lead vocal sit separately from the stereo information, the side channels, where pads, effects, and stereo synth elements reside.
Well, that's the benefit.
This can help clarify the center elements, enhance stereo width without phasing issues, and manage energy in specific parts of the stereo field, contributing to a cleaner, more impactful sound without just increasing overall level.
And harmonic generation and saturation, adding some grit.
Exactly. These tools add subtle harmonic distortion or saturation to the signal. This doesn't necessarily increase the peak level, but it adds perceived richness, warmth, and density, making the track sound subjectively bigger or fuller and helping it translate better across different systems, including making it feel more robust at lower playback levels.
Finally, there's the acknowledgement of aggressive but controlled limiting. So limiting is still key, but maybe smarter.
EDM masters will use significant limiting to achieve that characteristic density and high average level. But the key today, especially with normalization, is strategic and transparent application. The goal is to achieve the desired density and energy while preserving as much of the original transient impact as possible and avoiding audible distortion. It's about being aggressive with the gain reduction, but transparent with the sonic outcome.
This leads to that interesting observation in the source about the nuance of loud in EDM and charting tracks. It's not always as loud as people think.
Yes. It directly challenges the old paradigm that EDM must be mastered to extremes like Medicus LUFS to be successful or impactful. The source points to analyses showing successful, commercially charting dance tracks with integrated LUFS levels around Megadec 10 or Egeda 11 LUFS.
Like that Justice and Tame Impala track Neverender, which charted successfully at Nagnec 11.3 LUFS integrated. That's well below the old target, way closer to the streaming ones.
Exactly. That data suggests that a more dynamic presentation, even in a genre known for loudness, can be equally, if not more, effective and commercially viable in the streaming age. It shows that perceived impact comes from more than just a high number on a meter.
This really turns those old assumptions about EDM mastering on their head. It's not just about crushing it into a brick.
It's about intelligent engineering. Good and loud, especially in EDM, comes not from mindlessly pushing a limiter to the absolute limit, but from careful mixing and production choices that create perceived power and density before the final mastering.
Like fixing it in the mix.
Pretty much. The source mentions strategic sidechain pumping around the kick drum as a great example. This isn't just a stylistic effect, it creates small, intentional dips in volume for other elements precisely timed with the kick. This allows the kick's transient to hit hard and clear without having to compress the entire mix excessively, giving a feeling of rhythmic power and overall density without destroying the dynamics of other elements.
So it's about creating perceived impact through clever mixing and mastering techniques, leveraging the strengths of the genre, rather than just aiming for maximum numerical loudness. Smart loudness.
Precisely. And that brings us back to the source's ultimate recommendation. Trust your ears. Use good reference tracks, and let artistic intent guide your loudness and dynamic range decisions. Focus on the overall sonic quality, the emotional impact, and how the track will translate across different listening environments, rather than fixating solely on hitting specific, potentially outdated numbers.
It's a powerful shift from a technical race to a more artistic and listener-focused approach. Much healthier, really.
It really is. The tools and standards have evolved to allow for both precision and fidelity in the digital age.
Okay, let's bring this deep dive to a close. We started with the frustrating reality of inconsistent loudness and traced the need for objective measurement, driven by the subjectivity of human hearing.
We explored the fundamental language of the decibel, the crucial evolution of measurement units from simple peak to RMS, and finally to the psychoacoustically informed LUFS, designed to align with how our ears actually perceive sound.
We delved into the infamous loudness war, how it was fueled by digital audio and detrimental to fidelity, how things got way too loud and sounded worse for it.
And how the widespread adoption of loudness normalization by streaming platforms became the necessary countermeasure, effectively ending the competitive push for extreme loudness by turning down overly loud tracks and thereby exposing the sonic cost of overcompression.
We learned that the modern mastering philosophy, especially vital for genres like EDM, is about prioritizing dynamic range, sonic quality, and mastering for normalization, not against it, all while ensuring critical true peak headroom to prevent distortion on streaming codecs.
The ultimate goal today is to deliver a master that is impactful, clear, and sounds consistently excellent across all the diverse playback environments listeners use, faithfully conveying the artist's vision. Technical precision in loudness measurement is now truly in service of artistic intent, leading to a richer, more engaging auditory experience for everyone.
So hopefully for you listening, this deep dive changes how you perceive and appreciate the music you hear every day. When you encounter a track that sounds consistently great and impactful, whether it's a quiet acoustic piece or a pumping EDM track, you might start to hear the engineering choices behind it, the careful dynamic range, the strategic limiting, the attention to true peak that helps it translate cleanly everywhere.
And perhaps you can now better spot the tracks where the old loudness war mentality might still be causing issues, even after normalization.
Understanding these concepts truly allows you to listen with a more informed ear and appreciate the craft involved. A huge thank you to audiojack.com for providing the detailed and insightful source material for this deep dive. It was packed with valuable information that really let us explore this topic thoroughly.
An excellent resource for anyone wanting to learn more about the technical side of modern audio, for sure.
And that leaves us with a final thought to ponder as you go back to your playlists. Given how effectively loudness normalization works on most major platforms, ensuring everything plays back at a consistent perceived level regardless of its original master volume, does aiming for an integrated loudness significantly louder than the platform target, say, -8 LUFS, for an EDM track when the target is -14 LUFS, still provide any meaningful sonic advantage for the listener when heard via streaming?
OS is focusing on creating the best sounding mix and master with optimal dynamic range and true peak headroom at, or maybe closer to, the platform target truly the most effective path for consistent impact and quality in today's digital landscape.
Something to think about the next time you're critically listening. It's a key question facing engineers and artists in this evolving audio world.
Absolutely.
Right. Until next time, listen with new ears.